This one isn't working.
Either this one isn't working, somebody raised it also.
No, neither one of them is working. The sound person who's over there has left.
We wanted you to use this.
Doesn't say anything. Hello? Ah.
Do you want to pin it too and then move this in your pocket, or
All right.
that way you can walk around wherever you want. Do you
All
want to
right.
put that in your pocket, or do you want to put it on your?
Does this work now?
Let me
No.
bring it a little closer up to you. Do you want me to do it?
Yeah.
Let's try that.
How does that sound? It doesn't. It doesn't. Well, it's all right. We'll get the sound. Why don't you get the sound?
Get the sound back.
Yeah. Folks, do you hear that? No. Folks, we're going to start without. There is a sound person who is ultra reformed and has felt that it's all over. It won't work. Don't bother about it. So we'll have to do without the sound person.
Give me 1 second, I'll turn it up. Make sure it's up loud enough to turn on.
Okay. Okay. Well, listen to that. Okay, so I thank you for that because it would have been a little difficult just talking to you straight. This has been an interesting year. And I will proceed pretty well as I have in the past, if that's all right with you. Talk about a general theme to start with, and then go to the things that I've been doing. Good bit of that will be the Geiger College, but there are other items too. And then see what kind of thoughts that you have, which I should have expressed and I didn't express. Most of you in the last couple of months watched 2 movies that were serious. One was Dunkirk, and the other was Vietnam, which ended just the day before Yom Kippur. Let's look at those 2 movies for a moment. Dunkirk, certainly not a recruitment movie. There you had someone killed in the first few moments, and at the very end, the man wasn't shot, he was just taken prisoner. But everything possible happened in between. People drowned, people were shot, whatever bad things can happen in warfare happened there. But of course, when we look at that, we say to ourselves, okay, that set the stage for the survival of Great Britain. And Winston Churchill put it into a mood that all of us could understand. Optimistic, hopeful even in the worst of times, and expressed all that in a magnificent way. So Dunkirk was prelude, the rest we remember. So we didn't need anything beyond that. What about Vietnam? What could one really say about that? All one could really say at the end, or for that matter, anywhere along those days, all you could do is cry. There was nothing positive whatsoever. And that is what we really missed with these serious looks at our time. Other people have taken this in a very different way. Remember the ancient Greeks? Well, you're a long way from college, and I'm a long way from college also. But those plays, how did those plays go? Were there thousands of people on the stage? No. 3 or 4 people. What happened to them? What happened to them? They were killed, and that was their end. The Greek way of looking at life was it's basically tragic. There's nothing really wonderful about it. And the best you can do is celebrate the tragedy. And the Greeks did that magnificently. And what about other folks? Well, other folks have not been able to go that route. So what did they do? Many of them did absolutely nothing. That's what Vietnam did. And that's how we have approached this. It's there, it's thrown at you, and you make the best of it. And that's demanding far more than most of us are capable of or could even really think about. So the result is we have a tragedy in our time, a huge tragedy, and we've been unable to really cope with it or even deal with it. And after all, this goes far beyond any of the political circumstances which so many of us mourn nowadays. Yes, all of that is sad. Yes, all of that will destroy a good deal that has happened before, but it'll pass. We're accustomed to that. Good presidents, bad presidents, sometimes more bad presidents than good presidents. And we know that we will survive, and the country will survive. But the underlying tragic spirit which Vietnam showed so magnificently, what are we really going to do with that? How are we going to cope with that altogether? We may try the high road and say, well, you'll solve the problem by loving those around you, by loving the world around you, by having a really positive outlook on life. But are we really capable of that? Love is a wonderful emotion. But for most of us and for most people, it's temporary. It doesn't last terribly long. It may last, if you're lucky, a lifetime of marriage, but for a large number of people, a lifetime of marriage is a bit too long. So we go in that direction, highly idealistic, but it really doesn't work for us. Perhaps what works better is simply to look at the biblical stories, the stories with which we're all so very, very familiar. What path do they take? They start out in a wonderful, positive way. What could be more positive than the story of creation? And at the end of every day, the statement is, and it was good, and it was good, and it was very good. And what happens after that? The first pair, the first children, one kills the other. Well, that doesn't sound like it was very good. And what happened in the stories? The world starts working, as all of us do. And before long, we don't understand each other. And we simply go our own way. The story of the Tower of Babel. And the other stories, similar. They say, yes, it works for a while, but not very long. And that, for that matter, is the story of the patriarchs. Nice lives, but when you look at them closely, it's very long. A generation at the most, and in most cases not. So we have our view, which is not the Greek view, total pessimism, and not the highly optimistic view, which ignores everything around us. And our view, which is simply realistic. What happens in our lives? Some good things, some bad things. What can we do about them? Very, very, very little. And what do? We simply go on. And you might almost say that that is the Jewish way. Not high optimism, not high pessimism, but take it as it really is and look at it realistically and build a philosophy out of that. And that is the path that we have taken through our whole long, long history. And that's the path which the Talmud, a book, it's not a book, it's an encyclopedia, which we have largely passed by and not really studied. But if we studied it, we would see that it does not show us a highly optimistic path, and it doesn't show us a highly pessimistic path. It goes the path of realism, simple realism. And that's probably the best that we can hope for in our current civilization, because there seems to be no one at least at the moment, who rises above the pessimism, the dark, dark pessimism of Vietnam. It's not good to talk at the cusp of the new year in such gray terms. but perhaps gray is the best we can do at this moment. Occasionally, there are some glimpses of people who have gone further than us, usually because they have been in the very depth. And if one looks at the world scene, we can probably see a bit of that in two countries which have been part of this terror, which are really to blame for a good bit of it. Vietnam is one of them. Germany is another. And both of them have shown that it is possible, it's not easy, but it is possible to go into a much more positive path, to try to really rebuild from scratch and to try to redeem whatever is redeemable in the past. If you have visited Vietnam, and I have visited Vietnam, you can see part of that spirit there, and you see it in some of their writings and other things as well. Is that me? I hope not. And you see it as well, of course, and I've seen it much closer up in Germany, where there continue to be, especially in our regard, steps, major steps, by people, individuals, as well as people in leadership positions, to try to say, we are going down a different path. How sincerely should you take it? I think one should take it sincerely as long as one is not shown the opposite. And I've seen many signs of that. Some of them are really quite touching. One of them, for example, that has been repeated several times, when somebody has come up to me and said, people I don't know, people I've not worked with, and simply said, look, what we've done, I mean, from a person who is 20 years younger than I, who certainly was no way involved, was wrong. We need forgiveness. Would you forgive us? Well, who am I to forgive? Who am I to forgive a person who has done nothing wrong? But it's an attempt on the part of a reasonable number of people in a country that has much guilt on its shoulders, an attempt to say, let's go down a different road. What we need nowadays, as we look at our own life in this country, and our own life with the new hatred that's coming up and that surrounds us occasionally, is a beginning of a move in that direction, to see what can be done and what is possible and how far can we go in that kind of a direction. Let me turn to something else. Let me turn instead, or rather quickly, to what is to be the second part of this. What's happened to me in retirement? What am I doing in Germany or elsewhere? Actually, it's quite interesting to be at this stage, because what I've been trying to do in the last 2 years, perhaps a little further back, is disengage myself. What can you do after you have done all sorts of things in which you are involved to now say, no, I'm not just going to quit, but I'm going to give this on to somebody else. And I'm glad to be able to say that I have done that successfully with the Biblical Botanical Garden. I'm still the titular head of the garden, but if you've been out there and weeded, you will not have seen me weeding terribly often. My successor has been weeding, and weeded very successfully and has done it beautifully. And I'm glad that that's moving in that direction. And soon I will do exactly there what I have done with great success on this pulpit. Just sit there. There are, of course, other things in which I have been involved and in which I continue to be involved. And one of those, I am now trying to disengage myself. It's a little more difficult than the Biblical Garden. That is the Association for Progressive Jewish Law, an association that two of us established 25 years ago. One of my partner actually bowed out rather quickly. So I've been leading that for most of those 25 years. It's an organization of about 500 rabbis, lawyers, scholars scattered around the world. And we have 3 symposia a year on a particular theme. It really continues in some way the work that I did with the Responser Committee of the Reform Movement. But that got a little bit difficult after about 15, 16 years, because you are thrown questions every other week, and you cannot postpone the answer, because the people are there and they want an answer. It's not quite as critical as for an Orthodox rabbinic respondist, because when he is asked a question, it's often about a chicken. Is that chicken kosher or not? And you cannot let that chicken sit there for 3 weeks and give an answer then. So for me, it was answering in a timely fashion, which was interesting. It was a challenge, because after all, I was also rabbi of this congregation, and you threw other challenges at me which were not in the Jewish legal field. So after I was through with this, I decided, let's organize this differently. Let's have a society which answers questions from a Jewish, but a Reformed Jewish perspective, and provides them in a timely fashion, and not by one person. So we had, in each instance, 8 or 9 people responding. How do you know they'll do a good job? How can you make sure that people that you ask will give you something that's worth listening to? The answer to that's very simple. You threaten to publish their answer. And we've done that for 25 years with every kind of question under the sun, whether it's about Israel, whether it's about murder, whether it's about medical issues, whether it's about the environment. And so 25 books later, I've decided it's time to give this on to somebody else. And I hope that they will enjoy it also. Enjoying is not always the right word, but in some instances it is certainly enjoyable. Are there other things that I would like to give away? Yes, but some of them are rather difficult. And I must say that in one way I protected myself quite early. when I retired, I was, of course, asked by lots and lots of people to join their commission, their committee, whatever the task was. And I told them right away, I will join any organization that you have, any board that you have. But with the boards, I only have one caveat. I will only join it if it never meets. And that worked for me very well. I joined no organizations, and I went to no board meetings, and that pleased me greatly. But let me talk about an organization which is not going down that road as far as I'm concerned, the Geiger College, which all of you have helped me and Germany and German Jews in Europe generally, enormously. Where are we now? Well, let me give you briefly a total picture of where things are happening. Because after establishing the Rabbinic College, which went well with your help, and which continues to go very well with the generous help of the German government, but we started to look at this whole scene a little more broadly. What do you do when you're trying to reestablish a community? It's nice to have rabbis, but you need more than that. And in this case of Germany, what you really needed was an entire structure. So we went at this rather systematically, not perhaps in the right sequence in each instance, but we did it as it became possible. Rabbinic training, fine. It gave us 5 years actually, to see to it that there were some congregations to serve, because it would take us 5 years to train the rabbis, and the fact that there were no congregations, well, that gave us those 5 years to go in that direction. And we were helped, again, generously by the German government. In which way? Well, that's why most of our rabbis, not all of them by any means, are in Germany. Because Germany said, if there is a Jewish congregation, we will pay the salary of the rabbi, as we are now paying the salary of priests and ministers. So that gave us a basis on which to work with congregations, because the new Jews in Germany, all of them, fleeing from the former Soviet Union, had no way of knowing anything about congregational structure, congregational finances, or anything like that. So we didn't have to worry about that. And that moved us very well in a very positive direction. But things in Germany went considerably further than that. We discovered rather soon that the German government had a real interest in congregational religious life. It has done that for the Catholic Church and has done that for the Lutheran Church. How has it done it? It has supported them in many ways and has also supported young people. So there is an organization in Germany which supports young Catholics, and another one which supports young Lutherans. So we came to them and said, what about us? And what about Muslims? Will you support us? And they said, yes, establish your organization, we'll support you. Not through university scholarships, because German universities have no tuition, but through all the other things that happen during one's years in college. So we have an organization which helps young Jews try to find their way to Judaism, find their way to expressing their Judaism, whether it's through social action or other things akin to that. And how many do we have? And they're scattered all over the university structure. We have about 800 young people who are committed in university, not just to attend an occasional Friday night and get a good meal, but to actually do something, do some social action, do something for nature and for the environment and for all of that. And that continues to go in that direction. And more important for us, it does something totally different. In these German Jewish communities, you have Russian Jews who are automatically member of the community, but who know nothing about Judaism, know nothing about organizations, and so the congregations have a difficult time, but only for this generation. In the next generation, these young college students will be adults, and they will be able to go to the people who are now nominally in charge of the communities and say, this is what you should really do. And they'll have the chutzpah to talk that way to their elders and to say, look, you haven't done anything in the last 20 years. How about waking up and doing something? What'll happen? The obvious thing will happen. The president of the congregation, who has suddenly been put on the spot, will resign. And we'll have an active president, somebody who will really do something. So this is another part of this. And the additional leg of all this is an intellectual arm of Judaism. In our universities here, we have wonderful departments of Jewish studies, which offers scholarship on a high level in Judaism. We needed something like that in Germany as well. How would that happen? Well, my partner, Rabbi Homolka, who is very practical, who was not always a rabbi. Before he became a rabbi, he was very successful in business. In which way? He was the second in command of the largest publisher in Europe. And when something needed to be done, the man in charge said, look, we're having trouble with our paperbacks, fix it. He wasn't in the chain of command, and so the person to whom he said, this is what you should do, immediately said, who are you to tell me what to do? And he said, well, talk to my boss. And the man came back a day later and said, well, what would you like me to do? So the kind of person who can really get things done. And he saw that in the past in Germany, there had been a couple of university departments of Jewish studies, completely funded, of course, by the government. So he decided, okay, let's go at that again and see to it that this is reestablished. And he saw to it, not by fiat, but by working very well with the people in charge. Who are the people in charge? the people in the parliament. So he went to both parties, saw to it that they were involved, saw to it that they saw the value of this. And with a good bit of effort, in some ways something that we would probably hardly ever think of, he saw to it that 2 or 3 books on this subject were published, with Protestants and Catholics, with bishops and ministers who expressed the need for this in their realm, and then obviously the need in the Jewish realm as well. So within 2 years, the German parliament had seen to it that there was a fund for a Department of Jewish Studies at the University of Potsdam with 5 senior professors and 3 junior professors. Not bad if you're starting from nothing. It worked. And when the whole measure was finally celebrated at a large gathering with about 500 academics and others there, several people, of course, spoke. You think that we are sometimes long-winded. German parliamentarians have endless wind. 2 of them spoke up. 2 young people who were in their 30s, the head of one party, the head of another party. They gave lovely 15-minute talks on the need for this. One of them, of course, in German, the other in perfect Hebrew. He was not Jewish, but he spoke perfect Hebrew and showed the people that this is something that needs to be done, and explained it beautifully to them. So in this way, by having young people involved, by having academics involved, by having rabbinic and cantorial studies, we have pretty well a whole picture of what's necessary to establish and to really have Jewish life live again, not only there, but also in the neighboring countries, in Austria, in Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic rather, in Spain, in Italy, and in France. And so are rebuilding what was really just a total wreckage at the end of the Second World War, and are lucky enough now, with that support, with your support, of course, as well, to be able to move ahead there. Now that's part of my life that I'm not going to completely abandon immediately. I will leave it largely in God's hands to remove me from that scene. And otherwise, what else does a rabbi do? Well, this rabbi has to suffer with a real disease. The disease is called writing. So I continue to write in Jewish studies, law, of course, Jewish law, a little bit in horticulture, continuing Irene's work, and a couple of other things which are really not related to either one. But so, as you can see, I'm fortunate enough to be able to at least continue some of these things, and even more fortunate to be able to give them on to other people. That's a real blessing too, especially when you can walk away and say, you're capable, you're going to do a good job, I wish you luck. Any thoughts or questions? Yes. Yes, I neglected to mention one item. We have succeeded in training rabbis for Europe, but really for Western Europe. How come? Because for two reasons. One is when we had students come from the former Soviet Union, and that includes not only Russia, but the neighboring new countries as well, they tended to stay. Surprise? No, it isn't a surprise. You come to a beautiful place, you decide, okay, I'm going to stay, and you're not going to send me off to the hinterland of Russia to try to establish something. So the only way to get young Russian rabbis, liberal rabbis, would be to establish a training program in Moscow. Originally, we thought that was going to be extremely difficult, but it proved possible for two reasons. One is the training program which we have established in Israel for our students who spend a year in Israel has become very good and quite independent as well. So the Moscow program is based on not just 1 year in Israel, but 2 years in Israel, and then the other 3 years, not in Germany. We're not going to take them anywhere near Germany because we're afraid they'll stay. But in Moscow itself, how can you do that? To a fair extent, you can do that through Skype. So we have our professors go there for a month or two, become acquainted with the students, and then talk to them on Skype the rest of the time. And that works out extremely well. And we also send some of our students who are studying in Potsdam, Berlin, to Moscow to deal with them, not even in a very practical way, but to give them some feeling that there are other people who are rabbis too, who are their same age, and who are able to talk to them in the same way as a contemporary would. So this is just in its infancy. We are in the second year of that program, but it's going, and I think it will work. And the other part that is beginning to work is the simple financial part. In Russia, the Russian Orthodox priests are paid by the government. The Russian Protestants are not paid by the government. The Russian rabbis are not paid by the government either. But we've made at least a beginning in neighboring Poland, which had the same practice, but now has 3 or 4 congregations who are supported by the government, as are all other congregations which are not Jewish. So we hope that by either having some pull, put it this way, Russia is the way it is ruled. There are official ways of doing things and not so official ways of doing things and getting them done. And between the two of them, I think that we will be able to move in that direction as well. I'm not sure that we have not yet found a Russian Homolka, but we're looking for one. Yes? Well, we are lucky that we've had, the question was, what has happened to the liberal movement in Poland? But of course you have to remember that the number of Jews in Poland is small. Many of them are people who have come out of the woodwork. We're told that they were Jewish, were really raised in a totally non-Jewish environment and family. But we now have one rabbi and 2 students who are studying, who will be able to serve those groups, and perhaps not always in one spot, but moving around. And you'll have the very peculiar situation. I talked to one of these rabbis maybe 2 years ago, and it was around Christmas time. And I said, well, what are you doing? Anything special at this season? We tend to relax things in the United States at the end of December. He said, I do too. I have nothing going on whatsoever. After all the folks that raised me are Christians. And I go back to help them celebrate on Christmas Day. I'm not a Christian anymore, I'm a Jew, but we are all dispersing to our Christian parents. So a different situation, quite a touching situation, but there is some Jewish life in Poland. It will never be anything like it was before, but at least there'll be some small remnants. Yes? What kind of numbers are we talking about? In Germany, there are about 200,000 Jews. What's their origin? 180,000 of those are formerly from Russia or the Ukraine. The other 20,000, well, about 5,000 of those, perhaps even less than that, are Jews who originated in Germany. The other 15,000 are Israelis. I think, honestly, I must say that their Judaism is not quite as strong as the Judaism of the Russian Jews, for whom it's almost zero. But that's the reality. Yes? Sorry, I can't hear you. Education for children is carried out rather well all over the country. You're not going to have any day schools, with perhaps an exception in Berlin and in Frankfurt. But you will have good Jewish education, more or less on the same basis as ours. There are textbooks. And now we're not only talking about Germany, we're talking about France. They've published some very good textbooks. They have a very good monthly magazine. And to a lesser degree, that's true of the Low Countries, of the Czech Republic, and in some places. You know, we Jews are very peculiar people. Well, I needn't tell you that. You're part of that. So, for example, in Hungary, we have just sent a rabbi to Hungary. But there's been a Jewish community in Hungary all through the years. There has been a seminary in Hungary all through the years. But they don't get along with each other. So we try to support both without getting too many people angry. But usually, if you're simply providing some dollars, the anger doesn't last very long. What are the problems when you've got a community which has no background and a community which may in several ways be floundering? Well, the first thing that we do is we train our rabbis to function in virtually any Jewish setting. So if you asked one of our rabbis, bring him up here, bring her up here. We've got a fair number of women rabbis as well. And they listen to what you are doing and what you are capable of doing or not doing. So they would be able to conduct a service which is reform, perhaps even ultra-reform. They'd be a little surprised by that, so would I in that setting, or conservative, or Orthodox. I've gone to a synagogue where I had no idea what the custom was, and the man up at the pulpit was conducting what was clearly a completely Orthodox service. He knew it, and he knew all the poetry, and he knew the melodies. How come? After all, he was trained as a liberal rabbi, because he's trying to serve the people where they are, take them where they are, and perhaps move them in a direction, but they have to be able to function in that way. And ideally, we really should be able to do the same thing. I had a good lesson in that. I think I've mentioned that once before. In my second year at the Hebrew Union College, I did not take a high holiday pulpit because there was a small group in Springfield, Missouri, where my father was rabbi, of a united congregation, but that segment of that congregation had an Orthodox service during the holidays. And not only these holidays, but also Sukkot and Pesach. So they asked me, would I serve as their rabbi? And I said, sure. Of course, I didn't quite know what I was getting myself into, because studying the entire Orthodox service takes some effort. There is a huge amount of poetry, very complicated Hebrew poetry. If you're going to lead it, you should be able to fully understand it. And it's the kind of poetry where each word has overtones. That's the way it was written in the 8th century. And you should be able to think of those biblical and other overtones as you're reciting that. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do it honestly. I'll learn those overtones as well. And it was very, very interesting. Conducting the service was also interesting because, first of all, as you well know, I don't have a singing voice, but they had to get over that. So I led the service, okay. And then in the middle of the service, I had two of the machers of the congregation arguing with each other. Well, what were they arguing about? They were arguing about a very difficult 7th century Jewish poem. I knew how difficult it was because we had a scholar at the Hebrew Union College who specialized in that poetry and who spent the better part of a semester leading us through 2 poems. Now these 2 folks were arguing with each other as to how to recite this very difficult poem. And all I could do is stand there and laugh, because it was clear that neither one of them understood it altogether. But they managed, and we went on. So that's the way our students are also trained. Be able, when somebody shows up who claims to really know something, okay, say yes, all right, let's do it that way. And when you start stumbling along the way, he's then able to continue and lead it on. And that's worked really quite well. So our students have to be able to work across the board, and they are partly able to do that because they are really mature. By that I mean that they are liberal, yes, but they understand the other side too. And they're not going to take issue with you if you start down a certain road. The ideology, after all, in Judaism is almost always weak and doesn't amount to much. And if you find yourself in an orthodox position and start arguing really on basics, you'll find quite quickly that you'll be winning, because we just don't go down that ideological road very far, very often. Yes? Conversion is, there's quite a bit of conversion. And in order, again, you know, with, if you're trying to please the Orthodox chief rabbi in Israel, forget it. I was involved in one of those efforts to find a unified way of doing it, and there are some simple unified ways of going about it. And it was an interesting exercise, talking to people, listening to people, and then passing that message on to whoever was supposed to make the decision. I found that week was really very nice because the afternoons I was able to spend either with relatives or with libraries. And one library in particular, the Shalom Library, which has wonderful manuscripts. If you go into our hallway where President Taft hangs rather prominently, if you go back a few feet, you'll find a large piece of, it's really tiles in essence. The tile piece, which is about the size of that I am, comes from a book of the 14th century, which is a little smaller than this, and is one of the grandest illuminated biblical or illuminated manuscripts that exists. That is in the Shalom Library. The only place I've seen a good copy of it is right here. Unfortunately, it doesn't have a sign telling people what it actually is. So, what happened at the end of this set of sessions? I had a good time, seen some relatives, went home, the problem totally unsolved. You're not going to agree on a common conversion. So we did the next best thing. We simply converted people, as we do in each of these countries, in a liberal way. And then when they get to Israel, if they have any issues with anybody, they'll have to fight them out, or they will simply say, look, you're not going to recognize me as a Jew, okay, but I'm in the synagogue anyhow, and I'll leave it up to God to recognize me or not recognize me, and just leave me alone. And that usually works. Yes? about Israeli Jews. Well, Reform Judaism is certainly gaining a good foothold in Israel. And there are plenty of people to work with, because what are Israeli Jews really like? There's an Orthodox group, a growing Orthodox group, which has been helped by the government in many ways. The way that counts most is military service. So it's easy to be an Orthodox Jew. But what happens is that the Israeli Jews, most of the Israeli Jews, I don't know if I ought to say most, but a very high percentage are as Jewishly knowledgeable as the average American Jew, which means they don't know very much. They may be able to read Hebrew, but the fact that you can read the stock market in Hebrew doesn't make you a good Jew. And that's where Israeli Jews are. And at some point, and we are beginning to make some inroads into that, we are able to interest these people in a Judaism which is not Orthodox. Yes? Do we do anything to get people to join us? Okay. Okay, do we do anything to proselytize people, to bring them to us? Well, we really, yeah, okay. We do very little in that regard, and you have to admire Mormons in particular. If you see a group of people dressed like this, who are 20 years old, going around with a white shirt and a tie, they're likely Mormons who are trying hard and because they are trying hard, they are becoming better Mormons and more convinced Mormons. We don't do anything exactly like that. What we try is, you might say, a little more subtle. We welcome people, but we do not actively go after them. Any other questions? Yes? Sorry, I didn't hear half of that. American Jews investing. I guess I need to have my hearing examined. It's all right. Whatever the question was, I'll answer it privately.
Rabbi Jacob, I think what she's asking is, like I look at myself as a German Jew. That's where my ancestors came from. So, are you noticing an influx of Americans trying to send money to either support Germany and the Jewish movement there, or Hungary, or any other countries? Is there a new movement towards that? I think that's what I'm saying.
Well, as far as, you know, the good thing about America is we're generous. Somebody wants to start something in a country where Jewish population is sparse and they need some help, they can count on us giving them some help. And that's part of our spirit and has worked very, very well for us. I thank you very much for being here now, and thank you also for all the many ways in which you have been friends and helpful through the years. May this be a good year for you, your families, and all the generations. And at the moment, enjoy looking forward to a good meal. Thank you.
You told me last week to email you at your AOL address, and I thought I had it, and I don't.
W. Jacob, 303.
At AOL. I remember. It's like, now that you say it. It's not so